So when I first heard the term sequence knitting and found out a little bit what it was about, I immediately did two things. I first went out and bought Cecelia Campochiaro's book all about sequence knitting and read it from cover to cover. Was super intrigued by it all. And then I did the second thing and I stopped all my knitting projects and did nothing for like 2 weeks except play with sequence knitting. So what's all the buzz and about sequence knitting and what is it exactly? Well, let me share with you. Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and let's talk about sequence knitting. What is it exactly and what makes it so intriguing? Well, first let me just tell you that the concept of sequence in knitting is nothing new. I mean, that's what knitting is, right? We take a sequence of stitches, a knit and purl or whatever that sequence is, and we repeat that over and over again to create a beautiful fabric of knitted yarn. So sequence knitting is nothing really new. But what Cecelia kind of did in her book is she kind of opened up our eyes to the possibilities of sequence knitting by what I kind of think of it as messing around with it a little bit. So she kind of took the idea of a sequence of stitches and then said, well, what would happen if we added one more stitch to the row of your sequences? What would that produce? Well, it produces really amazing, beautiful stitch patterns that you might never have come up with just on your own. So let me explain a little bit about what sequence knitting is. And if you want to delve further into it all in great detail, please, I would recommend that you look and purchase Cecilia's book. I'll have a link in the description below if you're interested in that. But let me just kind of give you an overview and an over concept of what it is. So what sequence knitting is, as I mentioned, in knitting, there's always a sequence of stitches that you are repeating over and over again to produce a stitch pattern. Like, for instance, a ribbing pattern, like a knit 2, purl 2 is a ribbing pattern we're all very familiar with. You would knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2 all the way across your row and then repeat that when you turn your work. And normally you would, for that 4-stitch sequence, cast on a multiple of 4 stitches. So when you turn your work, you're always working in sequences of 4. Your knitting stitches will line up nicely and your purl stitches will line up nicely and you'll have this nice ribbing. But what Cecelia kind of suggests is, what if you added, let's say, 1 stitch to your cast on count? So when you are doing your knit 2, purl 2 sequence, you end up with 1 extra stitch at the end of your row. So you would start your sequence over by doing a knit stitch. Then when you turn your work, you would start your sequence over again and do knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, and you'd end up with an extra stitch at the end again. And what's happening there then is that every time you turn your work, your little sequence pattern of knit 2, purl 2 is shifting over by 1 stitch, and it shifts again the next row. And now you don't have this nice line of knits and purls anymore. You've got something completely different, this whole nother stitch pattern, just by adding that 1 extra stitch at the end and consequently shifting your little sequence pattern. Okay, and so now you can kind of start to imagine that there are endless possibilities to this, because you can take any sequence. It doesn't have to be a little short sequence like knit 2, purl 2. It can be knit 3, purl 2, knit 1, purl 1, knit 4, or whatever the case may be. And you can add any number of extra stitches to the end of your sequence, adding 1, 2, 3, whatever, to produce completely different results. It is a very simple way to knit, and the results can be really complex looking patterns, but the way you knit it is very simple. So I want to explain to you 3 different types of sequence knitting that you can do, and then I'm going to show you a bunch of examples, so it's not just all theoretical. We're going to show you some actual swatches that I knit of some very specific sequence knitting. Okay, so the first type of sequence knitting that Cecelia talks about in her book is the 1-row sequence. And that is what I just kind of talked about, where you take a sequence of knit pattern, knit 2, let's take the example of a different sequence. Let's say knit 3, purl 2, and then we'll add maybe 2 stitches to the end of that row. So we're going to knit 3, purl 2 all the way to the end. We've got 2 stitches left. We'll start that sequence over again by knitting 2. Then we're going to turn our work and start that sequence right from the beginning again with that knit 3. So we're not completing that last little bit of sequence that we started at the end. We're starting fresh, the new sequence, knit 3, purl 2. We'll end up with 2 stitches again at the end. We won't complete that sequence. We'll turn it and start over again with our next sequence. So that is one way to do a sequence where we are abandoning the sequence at the end and starting fresh with that sequence at the start of each row. Okay, so that's one row sequence. The next type of sequence is called a serpentine sequence. I wish it was called something else because I hate snakes, but it is what it is. So serpentine sequence knitting goes like this. Well, let's take that same sequence of knit 3, purl 2 and adding 2 at the end. So our first row will be knit 3, purl 2. We'll get to our end and we got 2 extra stitches, right? So we're starting our sequence over, knit 1, knit 2 actually, with those 2 extra stitches. Then we're going to continue that sequence when we turn our work, not stop it and start over, but continue that sequence. So we've already done knit 2, we'll just do knit 1 to complete knit 3, then purl 2, knit 3, purl 2, and we'll keep doing that, never ending a sequence or never doing an incomplete sequence, but continuing that sequence over and over, even when we turn our work. Okay, so the third type of sequence knitting is called the spiral sequence knitting, and that's what happens when you are knitting in the round like for a hat. So if you've knitted in the round before, you know that you're not just knitting one round and then bump it up to the next round and knitting another flat round and then so on. You're just continually knitting a spiral up and up and up, where you're never really kind of ending one row. You're just kind of continuing around and around and around for a spiral type of a knit pattern. So that's why this is called spiral sequence. And the concept is similar, where you would take a sequence, let's take that same sequence that I've talked about, that knit 3, purl 2, and then adding 2, you would do that sequence with those 2 extra stitches in your stitch count, but just keep doing that sequence over and over again in your round, never abandoning or doing an unfinished sequence, but just continuing the sequence continually in your knitting round. And when that happens is that you are creating kind of a really cool spiral effect, where your knit stitch sequence is shifting to produce this really cool spiral up and around the hat. So I will show you some examples of that as well. So that is what sequence knitting is in a nutshell. Let's stop talking about it and actually take a look at a few swatches so you can kind of see what some of these really unique stitch patterns look like when actually doing these knit sequencing. All right, let's take a look at some actual swatches using this sequence technique. I'm going to show you all 3 of the sequence techniques: the 1 row sequence, the serpentine, and the spiral. So let's take a look at this one first. This is the sequence we talked about earlier in the video of knitting 3, then purling 2. We continued with that sequence and then we added 2 extra stitches at the end. And then we would knit those 2 stitches because we were like starting over on a sequence, but then every time we turned our work, we started over with that sequence. But look at this beautiful result of that sequence. It produces this nice ribbing type effect. Whenever you do a 1 row sequence, you're always going to have some kind of a column or ribbing type of look to your pattern. Okay, I'm going to use that same exact sequence, and this time did it with a serpentine method. So this time I would just continue with my sequence after I turn the work, and this produced a much different look. It almost has like some kind of a patchwork type of design, very different from this, just by changing it to the serpentine method. Now that exact same sequence I did also in the round. So this one we did that same knit 3, purl 2 sequence, added 1 extra stitch to our stitch count, but just continued knitting 3, purl 2 sequence round and around and around without ever breaking up that sequence. And that produces this kind of very almost moss stitch like look in the round, when you can kind of see the diagonal feel and the swirling feel doing this with that swirl sequence technique. All right, let's take a look at a couple other sequence patterns. These 2 are using the exact same sequence, and this is the 1 row sequence. This is a serpentine method. This one is using a sequence of knit 8, purl 4, and then we added 3 extra stitches. So it's a little bit of a longer sequence. Adding 3 shifts it a little bit more each time. This again produces a very nice wide panel type looking, pleat type looking ribbing. And then this one is a serpentine method, which just creates this beautiful pattern. I'm actually making a scarf with this exact sequence, and it's turning out just beautiful. So again, 2 completely different stitches just by changing the sequence and the number of extra stitches you add to your stitch count. All right, here is another 1 row sequence. This one has a little bit more of a complicated sequence pattern, but again, we're just starting that sequence over again when we start each row. So this one's sequence is a knit 4, purl 2, knit 4, purl 6, and we added 2 extra stitches to our stitch count. But really, look at that, very interesting type of a ribbing, not something that you would probably normally come up with on your own, but it's just beautiful when you just apply these simple techniques. All right, I wanted to show you another spiral technique in the round. This one is, the pattern for this is knitting 5, then doing a purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and repeating that sequence. I just added 1 extra stitch to my stitch count, which caused everything to shift over, producing this beautiful spiral effect. This will, I think, would make a really pretty hat. Look at just these columns of that knit, purl sequence, just spiraling up the side. Beautiful. So that's another spiral technique. Then I thought, what would this look like if I did something in addition or different from your standard knit and purl stitches? What if I incorporated some yarn overs or knit 2 togethers? So I gave that a try with a 1 row technique, and I found this really lovely kind of a lacy type pattern. So what I did for this sequence is I knitted 2, then I did a yarn over and knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together. Repeated that sequence all the way across. I added 2 extra stitches to my stitch count. So when I turned the work, I just started that sequence again of knit 2, yarn over, knit 2 together, yarn over, knit 2 together, and it produced this very fun sequence. Now I'm not exactly sure how this would work doing the serpentine method, because you don't want to sometimes end up with needing to do a knit 2 together and you only have 1 stitch left. So I'll have to think about how I could maybe alter this sequence to make it work for serpentine. So, but for now, just this 1 row looks really pretty. Okay, so there are some really fun designs that you can create with these sequence techniques. They just make some really pretty designs, complicated type looking stitches, but it's really the technique to get there is just so easy. Again, if you wish to delve deeper into this technique and get all the ins and outs of it, please look at Cecelia's book. It's just full of information and just really goes deep dive into this technique. The link again is in the description below. Well, I hope you give this a try. Just play around with it. It's a great way to get out of a knitting slump. If you can't think of what new stitch to try to come up with something beautiful by just picking a sequence and adding a stitch or 2 and seeing what transpires. It could be a beautiful new stitch pattern that nobody ever thought of before. So thanks for watching, everybody. Give me a thumbs up if you like this, and don't forget to subscribe to receive future videos all about knitting tips and techniques, creative patterns and stitches. Happy knitting!